rockets alone. It's built on the dreams, risk, and relentless spirit of those who dare look up and say, "We belong there." For over 30 years, the Space Frontier Foundation has been a home for these visionary, radical, action-oriented individuals. Hear their stories, learn how space was shaped, and revel in the revolution of commercial space pioneers. Here's today with the inimitable Charles Miller. I know Charles from a bunch of my introduction into the industry, but for those who don't know, Charles, how far back does your involvement in this whole commercial space thing go? How did you get involved in commercial space in the beginning?
Well, that's a long story, Sean, but thanks for having me. There's a lot of space enthusiasts and more space advocates out there, so I'm happy to share my story. Hopefully others will take some lessons learned from it, not make the same mistakes I made. And I love the saying, make new mistakes. So share the history here of all the failures we had and the learnings I developed. And hopefully you'll make new mistakes, not repeat the old mistakes of the past. So I think this is a great service you're providing. It really started as a founding story, and it goes throughout my life. And I'll tie this back to that on occasion, is in 5th grade, I kind of, in hindsight, had a little bit of an existential crisis. I don't know if it's a real crisis, but I was like going, why am I here? What's the meaning of life? Why is my consciousness in this brain and not over there in that other person? And it's like, this is weird. And it just came to me, well, the answer is you're here to do something great, right? And it kind of resonated. My whole body kind of like, it was like, that was true. I'm here to do something great. And so what I realized in hindsight is I became a missionary in that moment, that I'd made a decision. My life was here to do something great. And then I just had to, what the hell did that mean, right? What mission was I on to do something great? Every decision I made, in the next 50 plus years is like, well, if it isn't about making a difference, doing something great, then I was just completely non-interested in it. And all my decisions from then on were out of that decision that this 5th grader made, just out of the blue. It just came to him. I didn't choose. It was just it was true, and I chose it. And so I loved space. I loved science fiction. I read all the classics. Probably the most important to me was Heinlein. There's Asimov and Clarke and Niven. But I love space, and I wanted to be an astronaut. I went to college for that purpose. And before
we get to college, hold on. You have to do something great, and you like space. What were the other things that you, as this 5th grader who now has this manifest destiny thing that you have taken on, what were the other things that 5th grade you was thinking about on how you were going to do something impactful? Like, were there other things?
Well, there are other things I quickly discarded. So I was good at chess, and I loved chess. In 7th grade, I went to some tournaments, and I did pretty well. I won a small prize, but I saw all these other chess players were so much better than me. I said, well, that's it. I'm not interested in that. I'm not going to be great. And I was just like, my mom just like didn't understand. It's like, well, no interest in that.
You quit chess, you did really well, and then you're like, yep.
But it wasn't great, right?
So, okay, good. All right, so what
was okay, move on, next thing. So I was constantly pivoting. And so this is that's a great way of, Sean, is like I pivoted quite a few times in my life in space. And it goes to mindset, right? And I know you care about that. It goes to mindset is like, what is your core reason for being? If your mindset is focused on something truly big and audacious, and you can have setbacks, but those are just short-term, near-term setbacks you learn from. It's like you do something different. You pivot. Entrepreneurs call it pivoting, right? Yeah. But if you have that mission, it keeps you going, and you just you learn from it, and you pivot and do something different.
Okay. So, all right, good. So there were different things you were trying, and they didn't resonate. They were nice.
Right.
And
so I love space, and I was thinking at the time, and this was the paradigm everybody was in. If you love space in the late 70s, early 80s, and I graduated from high school in 81, you're going to be an astronaut. And there's this thing called the shuttle. It was a reusable launch vehicle that it was gonna open space. It was the future. It was the leading edge of breakthroughs in space technology. And I decided, well, I'm gonna go an astronaut. I'm gonna go fly in the shuttle. I had to choose between going to the Air Force Academy or being a payload specialist, a scientist, and I chose the latter. And I decided to go to Caltech, which was the best, from what I could tell, college in the country to be a scientist or engineer. I went to Caltech, discovered another thing was like, I was naturally good in math and science, but I wasn't great. I met people who were great, and I also wasn't, I actually learned that I didn't like the doing of math and science. I actually liked much more interacting with people, policy, business, those types of things at the intersection of policy and business and science and tech. Learned I was great and I was very good at. Okay. And at first it was with policy. And so I was at Caltech and trying to figure out, well, what I was going to do. And it was actually my freshman year, my best friend he told me about this thing called the L5 Society. I go, L what? L5. And he said, you got to check it out. It's just like these really big ideas about what you can do in space. And I checked it out and it just, it blew my mind. This was greatness. This was something that you could set your life to do something great for humanity and spread life into the cosmos. And it was based on fundamental first principles on the physics by Dr. Gerard O'Neill. So I didn't run into O'Neill's ideas until late 1981 and through the L5 Society. And that the fundamental first principles is you could build large-scale settlements in space built on top of the foundation of large-scale industrial development of space, right? And there's these businesses, including space solar power and tourism, and I was just like immediately captured by the big vision and the ideas. And so at Caltech, I started the first chapter of the Caltech L5 Society, started inviting people to do that. So I just got into space activism because it would just capture me. Like, this was what I wanted to do. There's no question. I was doing this.
It was like a light bulb.
It was just a light bulb. And I just I made a ton of failures as a grassroots activist of trying to get people involved and doing things and being an activist at the local level, a whole bunch of wasted time, but it was all learning, all failures. Yeah. And so that's how it started.
Tell me a little bit more about you and the context that you were in. So it's great to understand as you are in your...
Well, this is post-Apollo.
Right, this is post-Apollo.
Everybody, so the context is the space shuttle is the future.
Yep.
That what succeeded was Apollo, this grand national vision by the president. Kennedy took us to the moon, from 61 to 69, did amazing things. And it was inevitable that this is how we're going to open up space, that this reusable launch vehicle and Apollo. And so that was kind of the learning. So I got organized. I was this chapter activist. I was a part of organizing the California Space Development Council. A bunch of the chapter activists in California all got together and started organizing bigger and coordinating. We formed the California Space Development Council that was out of the ideas of O'Neill. That became very organized on the West Coast. We were going to do whatever it took to, and part of it was like we needed a repeat of Apollo. Yeah. We needed to get the president of the United States to declare again that we should go to the moon and Mars and these big ideas. That was kind of conventional wisdom, and the shuttle was conventional wisdom in the early to mid 80s. Yep. Until it all fell apart, right? And then we were just wrong. The whole world was wrong, but we were just in this paradigm.
So you're iterating, you're testing different things. You obviously had locked at least partially onto space, right? Because you said, hey, that's where the future is in space. Okay.
And we wanted large-scale settlements, millions of people living and working in space. You may have heard that phrase. That was common in the L5 Society in the mid-'80s. Jeff Bezos has mentioned that in the last decade, but that was a common saying back in the 80s. That was our goal. Like, well, what do you mean by space? Well, we want millions of people living and working in space. And
it was built on, especially at the beginning of the 80s, that's built on the promise of a shuttle.
Cheap access to space. Shuttle was going to provide cheap access. That's how NASA sold it. Now, if you study your history, it's very clear from the historians who talked to the engineers, they knew it was a lie. But the NASA of the 70s said, we need a program to follow Apollo or the whole institution could go away. And the OMB and the White House and Congress said, well, we'll buy this reusable shuttle thing that can fly 50 times a year for $10 million a flight. If you can do that, wonderful. Started designing in the late 60s and where they were fully reusable and the tech didn't support it. And they said in the early 70s said, we can't get there. That the brilliant technical people at NASA knew they couldn't support it, but they sold it anyway. That's what the politicians and our elected leaders demanded to get the approval of the project.
And the young Charles Miller bought it.
Oh, I totally bought it. Hook, line, and sinker. And as I was in high school, that's the future.
Yeah, and you are obviously not alone in that. And
I think we all bought it. So very few people dissented until Challenger happened. And then I also want to give credit to the immediate people who recognized we needed to do completely something different because we learned from them. Challenger was the first breakdown leading to the breakthroughs. And then there was another breakdown with the vision for space exploration leading to more breakthroughs. But you have to have failure to lead to innovation and success.
Yes. Out of curiosity, how did your friend from high school that was in the Coast Guard Academy, you said he told you about L5?
Yeah, I was saying, remind me about, he said, well, he saw it in he was reading science fiction and there would be these ads by the L5 Society in the science fiction, magazines. And he thought it was really cool. And so he had talked to me. We just talked on the phone and told me about it. He said, you got to check this out. And so I did. And that was it. So
I don't know. Where's the Coast Guard Academy? Was that a long distance phone call?
Oh, that was a long distance phone call then. So that was an expensive phone call for the early 80s. So.
Yeah. I mean, friends talking on the phone, you were paying by the minute.
Right.
And that was valuable enough that
right.
You probably have gotten a good return.
We didn't do it all the time, right? So, but when we did, it was a short call. You catch up really quick when it's $1 a minute for the call.
All right, so you're introduced to L5, and numerous people mention L5 and the Gerard K. O'Neill, that O'Neillian vision, and your personal do something great. You've got space, and then it sounds like there was a click that happened. You're like, okay, I know the domain to work in, and now
the vision was the right vision.
Okay.
Our strategy isn't working. What's wrong here, right? You get this cognitive dissonance. I love the vision. What we're doing, it's not working. And so the first thing is the shuttle collapse. And I hadn't completely acknowledged that the shuttle was never going to succeed. A lot of people never did. Right. But so the first people, I think I really want to give credit. I think there should be books written on this. The first credit was at, I think, an International Space Development Council conference.
Okay.
And there was a group of chapter activists. They were actually the San Diego L5 and the Tucson L5 societies. The two leaders of those were Andy Cutler and Jim Bowery, but there was a bunch of other people, including a great friend of mine and a great friend of the foundation, David Anderman, who was part of the San Diego L5. What they said is, you know what? We need to get NASA out of the role of owning and operating the airline or the space line, right? And the way to do that is to start forcing NASA to express its demand for space transportation in a commercial way. And they drafted a bill. They said, you know what, we're going to draft a bill to require NASA to buy commercial launch services. And NASA owned and operated the Delta and Atlas, right? They controlled it, right? And they paid for subcontractors to build the systems and some other company to operate the launch vehicle. But they were totally in control, which is really weird these days. Sure. We never would have this revolution in space transportation if it wasn't for them and what they did next.
So that bill. All right. So you personally,
that was 1986.
Okay, and you graduated
after they started thinking about this. Part of the problem is they were very negative, and they were right to be negative about the government being in control. but the way they communicated, it was hard to get at the goodness of it. But they were totally right, that we need to privatize launch service. We need to force NASA to buy commercial launch services, get out of owning and operating launch vehicles. So it took us several years for them to do it. But they drafted what was the Launch Service Purchase Act that actually 4 years later in 1990 passed. And there's a fascinating history of it. They got the bill. They got their 2 members of Congress, Jim Colby from Arizona and David Packard from San Diego, a Democrat and a Republican, to introduce the bill. Now, most bills get introduced and never go anywhere.
Right.
The fascinating thing here is they introduced the bill, and then David Packard, the congressman from San Diego, thought he wasn't going to do anything about it. He got this call from NASA telling him as a congressman that he couldn't do this, that he couldn't pass the bill. Completely counterproductive, pissed off the congressman. And he says, I'll show you. And they actually, he went and worked all his colleagues on both sides of the aisle, and they got consensus like, we need to do this. And they passed the Launch Service Purchase Act of 1990, which was the first real breakthrough. I can trace a line to everything, all the big breakthroughs that have to today. So that was the beginning of the Launch Service Purchase Act. And it was very clear that General Dynamics and Douglas with the Delta, General Dynamics, the Atlas, reinvested in those launch vehicles, started operating and started selling them commercially, and it was having its desired effect. They privately invested in the next generation of those vehicles, and it had an immediate public, real impact.
I wonder who that NASA person was that made that call. I don't know if
I don't know who it is. Now, Courtney Stadd was also a entrepreneur at the time in the early 80s. He got personal calls telling him, there was zero interest from the U.S. government, NASA, in supporting private commercial launch entrepreneurs. And in fact, they did whatever they could to stop it. It was a threat.
So, and this, the creation of the world that we live in now did not happen overnight, and it took a whole.
It's like changing the direction of an aircraft carrier, right? Yeah. It's slow, and small changes back then have resulted in continual effort to huge changes today, and we still have more to go.
So we now have the context of late 80s.
So I didn't recognize it. I didn't recognize how important it was. I was like, this is interesting. And in hindsight, I should have jumped in and been all in on supporting it. And I was like, I wasn't against it. I was supporting it. There was a bunch of debate and fighting going on. Some very prominent space activists and space policy people reportedly were against it. I'm not going to name any names. Others may, but I just didn't recognize it. And then the vision for space exploration happened. We got what we asked for. The President of the United States, Bush 41, made a big announcement on the vision for space exploration that we're going back to the moon and Mars. And he directed NASA to support it. NASA came out with this $400 billion monstrosity about how and go back to the moon and Mars that was completely, and Congress said that's dead on arrival. There was no interest. Right. And as space activists, my friends Jim Muncie and Rick Tumlinson and Bob Werb at the Space Frontier Foundations and others there, Tim Kiger and Elisa Sisti-Wynn, had done this big petition drive. We got what was actually completely predictable now, and it was dead. In California, we were doing our thing, and half a dozen people for the Space Frontier Foundation. There was a dozen plus people from the California Space Development Council, fellow travelers. We were like, oh my God, what do we do? This is, a lot of people quit then. A lot of people just gave up then and went on and stopped being space activists. I didn't quit, but I was out of answers. I didn't know. Okay. This is like 1989, 80, 90. I was out of answers. I was like, I need to take a little bit of break. I don't know what to do. I don't know the strategy or tactics. I know our current strategy. I have the vision. I'm still committed to the vision. The strategy and the tactics aren't working. I need to take a break and just think about it. And that's what I did. I took a 2-year break and did something different. And that led to the breakthrough. It helped me think it through.
Were you full-time L5? I was all my How are you paying
Well, I
for your
actually
bills?
worked at the National Space Society for a little over a year as the administrator, as number two. I was actually working for Indian tribes in California at the time. I
Okay.
was paying my bills working for Indian tribes. I had managed one of the International Space Development Conferences in Anaheim, the 1990 International Space Development Conference. I pulled together a bunch of people. I gave Bob Zubrin from the Mars Society his first big venue to pull together what became the Mars Society, the whole vision and strategy that he laid out, and put him on like the concluding. So I'd done a number of things, but I was really out of ideas. And I was paying my bills by being a consultant for small tribes in California. I was helping them. I was paying my bills and helping local small tribes, Indian tribes in California, with their problems. And so I just stopped doing space stuff. I just went off full time helping out California Indian tribes.
And so the National Space Society at this time, somewhere along
that was post-merger. National Space Society with the L5 Society and the National Space Institute had merged around, I forget the exact year, 80 I think 86, 87, around there. Right after the merger, I'd worked at the National Space Society. Lori Garver was the executive director. She hired me out of college to be the administrator, and I did that for a year in DC, and then I moved back to California.
Did you know, by the way, a previous conversation, Bob Werb apparently had applied for the same job that Lori got.
He was a candidate to.
He was, and he's like, yeah, thank God they didn't pick me. But so, all right, so this community of folks, you've got a community that was L5, it folds in. You're working and supporting yourself in space,
right?
But there comes this.
I was working at something completely non-space that enabled me to do space stuff in my free time. At the beginning, I was like really doing half-time of that, enough to pay my bills.
Yeah.
And I wanted all on in space. And I said, you know what? I'm out of ideas. I'm just going to go full-time working for California Indian tribes. I started with one tribe, soon helping dozens of tribes all across California with their political issues, with their policy issues, with working with the government, with economic development, with training their governments, organizing them. And the fascinating thing is that led to the next breakthrough, right? Okay. Sometimes you just need to let go of it and do something completely different. Yeah. And so what happened is one of the tribes came to me and said, we just lost $5,000 paying a consultant to help us try to get some money from Congress. And here's the problem. And what do you think? And I said, I think you need a different strategy. And they go, what? He's like, don't just send your money to a consultant and let them do it. This is a democracy. You have the right to assemble and go represent your views. I would say organize these 17 tribes called the Tilly Hardwick tribes together, go to DC, tell them your problem, and say you want help and want them to fix it. And this is why. Make your case. And they said, that's a great idea. Will you do that for us? And so I was working for one of the tribes, and I said, sure, I know what to do. I'll help organize the tribes together. We'll take the elected tribal leaders to DC. I wrote the 5-page white paper about what the problem was, how it was created by the U.S. government. It's what the U.S. government had done to these tribes. This is what I proposed to fix it. And I drafted it, and then we had half a dozen of those leaders. We took a trip together to Washington, D.C. We met with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. We met with Congress. Took us 2 years, and Congress said, you're right, we should fix it. And we created a permanent appropriation for these 17 tribes that totally changed their future. All the tribes across California, there's 100 of them, said, what did you do? How did you do it? And obviously, you can see from the video, I'm a white guy. They elected me. They wanted to elect me the leader of the newly created California organization of all California small tribes. And I said, that's a really bad idea. And they said, okay, I said, why don't you just have somebody else do it and I'll help? And they said, no, you got to be a leader of this. And they insisted. And I said, well, I'll be the vice chair and then let Les, who's the chairman of another tribe, he be chair. And they said, no, you got to be co-chairs. So they really twisted my arm. And then we did the same thing again 2 years later. And we changed national Indian policy for all small tribes across the nation. and that there be a minimum level of funding. We called it base level funding for small tribes to organize their tribal governments because of all the things. It's like these small tribes, have a hard time jumpstarting their economies and their governments. And they said, you need to create a base level funding. And everybody agreed. The members of Congress agreed. The Bureau of Indian Affairs agreed. And again, we changed the national Indian policy.
Did you call up your 5-year or 5th grader self and say, hey, I did it. I have had a great impact.
You know what? When the first time it was a memorial, I was all by myself, and I've heard that we've gotten this $1.7 million permanent appropriation for 17 tribes, and every tribe would get $100,000 a year. I actually went and bought myself a drink. I still remember the moment. It resonated. It still sticks in my memory. It's like for the first time ever, I did something that made a real difference. I just celebrated myself and went and had a beer. And it's still, I knew exactly where I was at that moment when I learned. And for the first time, I said, I did it. I made a difference. Same thing with changing national Indian policy for all small tribes. That happened, Sean. I'd actually forgotten about that. So it kind of resonated with me.
While you are focused on solving this other problem, where is the space?
So I'm continuing to think about space. Space is my real passion.
Are you talking about when the meeting is over with the tribal council and you're standing around getting coffee? Do you go, hey, by the way, have you heard about the latest thing? And are you talking about it with?
Probably still staying in tune with friends. I think I maybe was writing a monthly column for what was called the Spacefaring Gazette that the California Space Development Council is going on. I'm still thinking about it, but it's not all in. Still engaged and thinking about it, and I need a new idea. And so what I did with Indian tribes was the new idea. I would go to DC, focus on talking to Indian Affairs, and then while I was there, I'd go see the Space Subcommittee people, or I'd go see Tim Kiger in Congressman Rohrabacher's office, who was working there. So I would just keep in touch. There was the DCX going on. The Space Frontier Foundation was doing that. I was still involved with this California Space Development Council. Ben Muniz, I think, was president. I said, okay, I'll be vice president. And we wrote a paper. That was started the learning from, the Launch Service Purchase Act. We attacked what was going on in the NASA over the X-34. They gave out a sweetheart deal to Orbital Sciences on the X-34, sole source, no competition. X-34 was an X vehicle focused on reusable launch technology. That was was a Mach 6 I think may go to Mach 8 reusable first stage. And they didn't have any competition. They gave a sweetheart deal to Orbital because J.R. Thompson, former deputy administrator, was now number 2 at Orbital. Okay, this is not how you open up space by giving sweetheart deals from NASA to their favorite contractor. Yeah. And we attacked it. And we asked people to call the White House and protest it. And a bunch of people did. This thing starting the internet, we were encouraging people of the internet. I think this is 94. And encouraging people to call the White House and protest what was going on with NASA and X-34. And a bunch of people did. I heard later from a NASA executive that he got called in the carpet in front of Dan Golden and yelled at. And they made changes to the program that eventually collapsed it. And Orbital had their own reasons for getting out. They didn't there was too much control by NASA Marshall telling them how to design their X-34 rocket. And so it all collapsed. So that was another success, right? That trying to stop the stupid stuff that was going on in key areas. And then there's the DCX program that the Space Frontier Foundation was more focused on than the California Space Development Council. The California Space Development Council, we don't trumpet this, attacked the X-34 and stopped that, and they were focused on DCX. But meanwhile, the light went on again for the next big idea. Because of what I'd done is we had changed national Indian policy. The tribes themselves went to their representatives and made their case. The light went on, and I talked to my friends on the Hill on the Space Subcommittee, and I said, what if private citizens showed up and started briefing Congress on their vision for space and what they think their elected leaders should do. And what if we, and at the time, the space subcommittee staffer said, well, that's a great idea. By the way, we could give you the committee hearing room for the science committee hearing room, and you could hold an event. And so that's exactly what I did in March of 1995. I organized the California Space Development Council, the Space Frontier Foundation, and the National Space Society and the Space Transportation Association to support this grassroots effort, including private citizens going to Congress. It was the first March storm. And we organized an event on Capitol Hill. And so we were already spooked some of the power interests that be. I was attacked, but you don't want that crazy Charles Miller in charge of it. Let National Space Society be in charge of it. They called up Bob Walker, the chairman, and scared him. And so I got a call from a good friend of mine. Shanna Dale was staff director at the science committee. She said, we need to take this away from you and let somebody else be in charge of it. They gave the National Space Society in charge of this event on Capitol Hill that I'd organized, had the whole agenda, everything. This is a week out. And I said, fine, this is not about me. This is about doing the right thing. They took it over, and then the National Space Society tried to take over the lobbying event or cancel it. I said, I don't understand. They had withdrawn their support. They were going to call and make all the meetings a few weeks out. And I said, sorry, you're not going to have the event. And I said, what do you mean? I said, well, we're withdrawing the support for setting up the meetings. I said, you don't understand. This event's going on. I'll set up the meetings. And so from California, these long distance calls you're talking about.
Yeah.
My support staff made all the calls. We set up 52 meetings 2 weeks out for people to go have meetings. And so this is where the missionary takes over, right? It's like, what do you mean? I'm not quitting. I just put all my clients, Native American tribes, on hold. I said, I'm taking the next few weeks off. So, we'll get back to you. And we had 8 other people join me in DC for a week. And we had 52 congressional meetings in March of 1995. We had the events, went great. Newt Gingrich spoke, and he laid out for the first time we should privatize the space shuttle. Shocked everybody. I think he just become Speaker of the House. And then we briefed 52 members of Congress. And the most compelling thing that came out of this, we had one meeting. It was Mike Heaney, who was one of the original 9, who would become a chairman of the Space Frontier Foundation later. We had a meeting with one of the 52 meetings with the staff director of Defense Appropriations. And there was this idea called X-33. It was a follow-on to DCX that Tim Kiger and Dana Rohrabacher were championing, and he didn't want to do it. He was being tarred and vilified for being against the future. And we sat down with him, and I said, well, he said, what do you want? And I said, well, we'd like to have a fly-off between NASA and the Air Force for competition. There should be 2 X-33 prototypes. And he says, well, I can't do that. And that, in many cases, that would have been the end of the meeting. And I go, well, what could you do? He says, well, I could fund $100 million for in the Air Force for RLV technology development. And I thought about it a second, and I go, okay, that's a deal. We ended up, and we were supposed to get support from the Senate, right? And so we didn't. They ended up getting $50 million in the House appropriation, nothing in the Senate. They went to conference, got $25 million. That went to the Air Force. A good friend of ours named Jess Sponable received that money. And so from us, this is 9 people. The very clear result is 9 people got a $25 million appropriation created for reusable launch vehicle technology. 1 week of our time is like, you round it up, it's $3 million. So our mantra the next year is 1 week of your life worth $3 million. And the next year we had 40 people show up at the March Storm. And we had everybody's attention then. So that was the start of a big breakthrough, that the insight that we are private citizens living in a free society. Our power is in exercising our rights and going to our elected leaders and presenting our vision and what we think Congress should do and what the U.S. government should do to implement our vision. We should not be depending on big government agencies or big budget scientists or aerospace companies to do our work for us. That's abdicating our responsibilities and in implementing. So I learned this from Native tribes, right? Don't let somebody else do it. You go do it.
Right. So
right? That was the breakthrough.
How many of these first 9 were Armani suit wearing, K Street, like refined lobbyists? Like,
well, none of them were refined lobbyists. There was at least one of them was refined suit wearing, but he's a brilliant friend. His name is Ransom Wooler. And he was a lawyer in Illinois, but he loved space. And so he got involved, and he actually got lobbied by the National Space Society. What, are you sure you want to do this with this crazy Charles Miller guy? And he was like, he told me all about it. And he had a great time, and we had tremendous results, right? But there's always pushback. Like
what
there's
was the
always somebody
resistance?
threatened by it.
What was the threat? Like, what was it about NSS? Was it something?
At the time, the National Space Society was still in the old paradigm that we needed to do partnerships with big aerospace companies, and we go along to get along, and we need to be good to NASA. We can't create conflict with NASA. And, we just support. We're cheerleaders. We're supporters. We support the existing program. And we were change agents, right? This is the change agents got together and said, that doesn't work. And we need to do an alternative vision. We're not going to get there by supporting it. And the vast majority of space, space supporters at the time didn't get it. So we were the change agents, and when we advocated a different strategy, it was a threat to the status quo.
Okay.
And that's what you have to acknowledge. It's like, yes, those are good people. They're not going to like it. I then lived the next 20, 30 years. I'm still being a threat to the status quo, right? You just have to know that's part of the mantle you have to take on, right? And that it's going to come and you're prepared for it. And that's every change agent runs into that.
That's part of it, right? The objective is not to get a majority or a supermajority necessarily agreeing with you. It's not about popularity. It's about getting enough people to move your ideas forward.
Right.
So when you have these conversations on the Hill, and again, some of the folks, I'm going to guess many of the folks that will watch this conversation haven't done this sort of thing of going to the Hill. And I'm going to ask the question that that has the answer built into it. But like, was that a thing that was only available back then? Like that you could actually go and talk to Congress?
Oh, it's really easy. They didn't have any security. You just walk in, so you still can get in.
Yep.
But it was like, it was against conventional wisdom. Everybody just assumed you kind of support by writing letters that was top down, and you support the existing program. The aerospace companies were donating to the National Space Society, and they would withdraw their support if you didn't do exactly what they want. That's how they control, is by giving you money. And they control the narrative, and they influence you quickly, subtly through, I don't want you to do that, right? And there's always strings to the money, and so that was all part of the problem. And they have their lobbyists go to the Hill, and they control the communications. And so if there is not an alternative view, it takes a while to break through the noise. You have to do it consistently. You have to have a powerful, effective message in the first place. You have to have your arguments all lined up. You have to know what you're talking about. But if you have a powerful vision and an effective message, and you deliver it consistently, and you give them something specific to do, and give them the reason of why they do it, the vast majority of people in the Hill want to do the right thing, right? Most of the people you're talking to are 20-somethings, and it's still the same. Early 20-somethings. They're a few years out of college. They're idealists. They want to do the right thing, and most of the breakthroughs in policy and law in the United States are actually completely bipartisan. You see all this fighting in the news, but that's not how most stuff gets done. It's, most stuff gets done in a bipartisan manner. It takes at best a couple years to get enough consensus to break through. But if you do it well, you can make huge changes over time.
Yes. And you don't have to be a experienced space professional to be able to do this, because at the time you were doing this for the first time, you weren't the Charles Miller that you are now. You were the younger version who was like, hey, let's just go and talk to people. So I think...
Well, it's just like being an entrepreneur. It's like when the first time I did it, we didn't know what we didn't know. And we just constantly made it better, right? We learned. And I'd already kind of learned through working for Indian tribes, how to do it. I'd been studying and thinking about it, and we just constantly got better. So you kept iterating but what you have at the core is a powerful vision, a powerful strategy, and very concrete, specific things you can do. And you kind of anticipate the reasons they'd be against it. And there's always dozens of things you could advocate, and you need to hone it down to the top 3 or 5, right? Yeah. And so these are the reasons, things we're going to do this year. So
March Storm, the first one works well.
Second one blows the bolts off, and the next couple years, the second year, and in the first year we were pushing commercial space. 95, 96. We really formally started pushing what was the Commercial Space Act. It was a catch-all. Bob Walker, chairman of the House Science Committee, and the people, and Newt Gingrich, but it was bipartisan, but there were more leaders on the Republican side. Dana Rohrabacher, Tim Kiger moved over to the Senate. Muncie came to work for Capitol Hill for Rohrabacher. So we had advocates on both sides and both houses. Key thing in that bill that we were in 3 years going to get passed. We got it through in 86 through the House because Bob Walker and, as Science Committee chair and Newt got it through. But the Senate at the time was the black hole space. Right. And so it took us 2 extra years, 97, 98. We intensely focused on getting this bill passed in the Senate. And it took us 2 years of extra work. And by 1998, we got it to the Senate. The House kept on passing it, the Commercial Space Act, and it became known as the Commercial Space Act of 1998. And in hindsight, the biggest breakthrough thing in that bill was a complete extension of the Launch Service Purchase Act of 1990. We extended it by commercial services to space station cargo delivery services, right? Okay. And so that became everything a decade later to the creation of SpaceX. SpaceX was on the verge of collapsing and going bankrupt. It's been in all the histories that have been written. Elon acknowledges it. In December 2008, December 23rd, 2008, 2 days before Christmas, Elon was, on the verge of mental breakdown. He was a month away from losing both Tesla and SpaceX and running out of money. And no one gave him money because of the collapse in the financial markets. And he didn't know what to do. And Bill Gerstenmaier, who's head of human spaceflight, called him up and said, Elon, I am calling to let you know you have gotten a $1.8 billion contract from NASA for commercial space station cargo delivery. NASA would have never, ever done that if it wasn't the law forcing them to do it. And that was us. That was space advocates in the 1990s made that happen. And that so we directly caused this revolution.
And it's not like you were doing it for Elon, because
we were not doing. I didn't know who Elon was. So we had trust in the American entrepreneurial spirit that as a new strategy that we should leverage commercial space innovation. And we just had faith that if we changed the policy to force NASA to buy commercially, that the American entrepreneurial spirit would make it happen. That we just had faith. It was faith in the American entrepreneurial spirit that if you change the policy, it'll work. And the members of Congress who made it happen had the faith. And we didn't know it was a guy named Elon. We just had that belief. All those people who came to the Hill and all the fighting for years, that made it happen.
And that lesson is one of the ones that's really important, because as people enter into this industry, we can see that, oh, okay, it makes, if you dial a high enough level, you go, okay, well, we had the big rocket, then we tried the shuttle, and now we have these other rockets, and it just makes.
We still have the stupid big rocket. That's another story.
Yes, but like it seems natural, and you can just be like, okay, sure, that's the way things are done. But the fact of the matter is, we can benefit today from those things that were laid.
Yeah,
but there's more still to be done.
There's more to be done. So it's just an extension of everything we've done that's worked very well, right? So this is the time, since a lot of space frontier advocates are listening. So this is about the time, 1986, after the second March storm, and it was hugely successful. That's when the California Space Development Council and the Space Frontier Foundation, who had been working together, the foundation had supported I was still part of the California Space Development Council and a leader there. I was the president. And we had other National Space Society people they hated the success we were having. They wanted to come in and vote us out of the California Space Development Council. And meantime, they didn't know that I was, us, David Anderman, Ben Muniz, bless his heart, passed away, who was part of that, and other grassroots activists in the California Space Development Council. We were already talking to the Space Frontier Foundation about a merger. And so it was rather easy, we'll just keep the Space Frontier Foundation's name. But from my perspective, if you study it, it was a merger of equals, and we just let them keep all the credit. But everything that came there with the huge growth in the Space Frontier Foundation throughout the rest of the decade and the next decade was really the partnership of the media operation the foundation led, but the 1-2 punch with what we were doing on Capitol Hill, right? A huge number of foundation advocates, I would suggest the majority of them the next 5 years were people who came out of the March Storm and ProSpace, because we renamed the March Storm to ProSpace. And, people like David Anderman and Margot Deckard and Karinia Cusick and Mike Heaney and others, proving they had the vision and they're an activist by doing the March Storm, and then they got pulled into the Space Frontier Foundation. So the foundation had a rather fast growth rate and became named the pound for pound, the most influential space activist community in the world, organization. Bob Zubrin, then at the Mars Society, stated that. The foundation took over the leadership role clearly in the future of space, and at that time.
What was, besides, a week, a year, what else was part of your world during this period of time? So the March Storm.
I was still, in the early 90s, I was still paying my bills by working for Native American tribes till about 1998, 99. For the first time, I'd been supporting commercial entrepreneurs changing laws, but I never thought the time was right. I thought it was irrational. And then in 1998, I co-founded my first commercial space startup called Constellation Services International. It was David Anderman and Ben Muniz and I. In 1998, we started a company, and we originally started focused on a way to repair, maintain, upgrade satellites in the big constellations of satellites at the time that were like Iridium and Globalstar and Skybridge and Teledesic. And we had a way to repair them. And the way was if you recall, we were partners, we were allies with Russia. Boris Yeltsin was president of Russia. And so we had a way of using Russian technology. It was actually lunar lander technology called the LK, or the T2K was their prototype. And we said we could turn that into a reusable space tug that could park at the International Space Station And by the way, we'll park it there. And when a satellite that's at a higher altitude, but basically the same inclination as the space station, we could take those astronauts could go up for a couple days to a higher altitude, repair the satellite, and then come back down. And it was just the marginal cost of a few days' time of the astronaut, and they could repair the satellite. So it was a cool idea. Failed for many reasons. It just didn't fit. It was too big of an idea. We needed hundreds of millions of dollars to make it work. But it was my first entrepreneurial effort, CSI, or Constellation Services, and we then pivoted several times there. But that was what came next to me.
And that
now for the first time becoming an entrepreneur in the late 90s.
And just in case folks aren't aware, that same idea continues. Satellite servicing continues to be the hot new topic. So when you hear people today talk about, the hot new thing and the brand new company that has this revolutionary idea,
I haven't seen many new ideas. So Link is a new idea. Most of what I see going on is old ideas, right? Some of them really cool, and I'm glad people are funding them. But my problem is many of the ideas I see is like, I know the problem with them, and it's like, that's a great idea in 5 years or 10 years, but this is why I would not do that yet. But just like me, my first idea made no sense. In hindsight, it was, I now know all the reasons it wouldn't, but I learned from it.
Yeah.
So I hold my powder unless I'm asked by one of my friends who's a venture capitalist. If somebody asks me, who's a space entrepreneur, it's like, what do you think of this? I'll give them my feedback in private. And it's like, you're investing your time. You should know what you're up against and what you need to solve that. I rarely get asked that. But
is that because people know what you're going to say and they're like,
no, if I was a space entrepreneur, I would go to someone like me and say, this is my idea. Tell me how to make it better, or tell me what the problems are, because I'll be forewarned and maybe I can go solve them, right? That would be if you're truly committed to learning. So two things you need. So obviously, based on what I've said as a missionary, I'm completely stubborn. I don't quit. If you can combine that with becoming a learning machine, over the long term, you'll never be stopped. But not wanting to hear the faults in your plan, that's a problem you can't fix. You should want to hear the problems your plan as early as possible so you can fix them, so you can learn what to address. And so sticking your head in the sand and not asking for that is a fundamental flaw in personality. An entrepreneur should get over that, and if should want to hear what the problem is, right? You're only limiting your own ability to become great.
Charles Miller's prescription is grit plus growth. I guess that's
learning machine.
Yeah.
Right. So grit. Right. Yeah. I guess that's your way to say growth. So.
Yeah. All right. So. As we wrap up this piece, and I know we're leaving huge chunks of the industry's history.
Yeah, we later created New Space. The Frontier Foundation created the whole mantra and strategy. We did a pivot in the early 00s from what are we going to do now? The foundation did another pivot, and we decided, we had a big debate. Rick, my good friend Rick Tomlinson wanted to let's go do the moon and let's go do asteroids. And Bob Werb and I and others said, we completely disagree. You said, we need to focus on leveraging commercial space. There's not enough investment in it. Rick loved this alt space theme. And we said, let's do new space. It was, several of us, Bill Bolin, Bob Werb, and I, it's we need an alternate to alt space. And I read this book called The New Thing, and it came to be New Space. And I took it back to Bill Bolin and Bob, and they said, that's a great idea. And Bill said, put it together in one word, New Space. And that became the meme, right? We then changed the annual meeting to the conference to New Space. We located it in Silicon Valley, and we changed how a lot of this is changing how people think. We changed how Capitol Hill thought about space, right, with the Mars storm, but we brought the conference to Silicon Valley. We changed how private investors thought about space, right? This new category called new space that just drives the old space people crazy. They hate it, right? Which is it's like you hear these conferences attacking new space. Well, we're new space. And, you've won when all the old space companies are saying, well, we're new space too. Right. So, and then they're having conferences attacking new space. That's when you won. And now there's all this investment. And so, again, that's a huge breakthrough for the Space Frontier Foundation that led that.
So I want to have you back when we get to the next season and we can move into some of because there's even more stories.
Yeah.
But do me a favor, as you wrap it up, tell me how that doing something great then fits into kind of what you're doing now, and how much have you met that objective that you set out for yourself?
Well, the great thing about Link, so I when I was at CSI, we were watching the inflection point called small satellite revolution. And we knew this was a breakthrough, kind of comparable like the personal computer revolution, writing Moore's law. And I went looking for the breakthrough small satellites. That's kind of like the analogy is the VisiCalc that was personal computers, the emerging killer app that nobody thought of. I went looking for the emerging killer app for small satellites that nobody thought of. We found it. It's satellite direct to phone. And that's a whole nother story. We are going to connect everyone everywhere on the planet, satellite direct to the phone. And we're going to use free enterprise and technology innovation to pull the next billion people out of poverty on this planet. Now, that is greatness. So that everybody here at Link loves what we're doing. And we've proven it. Everybody thought we were crazy. That's impossible. Well, now we're doing it. We've proven the tech in 25 countries. We are the world's only operational and commercially licensed at-the-phone company in the world for connecting standard, ordinary mobile phones.
Charles, anything that folks watching this conversation can do for you? Do you have any requests of folks that we could do something to help you
carry out the mission, right? The broad mission, large-scale economic settlement and development and settlement of space. That's what I would ask you to do. Figure it out. Don't give up. Never, ever, ever quit. If you fail at something, learn from it and try something different. Figure out what didn't work and do something different. Carry out the vision. That's what I would ask from this audience.
All right. A simple task. Just do it.
Just do it.
Yeah. Charles Miller, an advocate of the Space Frontier Foundation, a clear pioneer, one of the people who actually laid the tracks that led to the space world that we enjoy today. Thank you so much for your time and for your wisdom and for your service to the frontier.
Thank you, Sean.